They had just climbed onto an abandoned pyramid when several Mayans suddenly rushed out and surrounded them. The leading Mayan was extremely agitated, shouting angrily at the group, but none of the 6 could understand Mayan, making it impossible to communicate with him. Seeing the other side getting more and more agitated, Matthias hurriedly took out a photo of his brother and held it out, showing that they were only here to find someone and meant no harm. Meanwhile, Amy raised her camera and kept stepping backward, wanting to take pictures of the scenery here as a memento. But the sharp sound of the shutter instantly enraged them. They stared angrily at Amy in the grass and aimed their weapons at the 6 of them. Mistaking it for a place where photography was forbidden, Dimitri immediately rushed to Amy's side, grabbed the camera and tried to hand it to them in apology. But what responded to him was a suddenly shot arrow, followed by a gunshot that pierced the quiet air. Seeing this terrifying scene before them, they screamed in fright. But the Mayans became even more agitated and moved closer to them. In desperation, they could only grab the luggage on the ground and frantically rush toward the pyramid behind them. Soon, a large number of Mayans surrounded the entire pyramid, even setting up tents nearby. They could only climb desperately to the top of the pyramid, trying to stay as far away from the Mayans' attack range as possible. Everyone was confused by this sudden encounter, except Matthias, who was searching for something nearby on his own. Finally, he stopped at a place covered with vines and frantically tore at the tangle of vines. Inside lay his brother, who had died a tragic death, and an ear-piercing scream instantly erupted. After Matthias calmed down slightly, Jeff helped clean the scratches on Matthias's hands with clean water. Then Jeff asked Matthias for his phone, since it was the only one among them still with a signal after entering the jungle. But worse, the phone was already in the hands of the Mayans, and they were completely trapped here. Fortunately, Jeff suddenly remembered that 2 Greeks had said they would come to visit, and their hotel booking only lasted until tomorrow. As long as they noticed they had not returned, the others would definitely send someone to rescue them. They only needed to wait here and hold on until the rescue arrived. At that moment, a crisp ringtone suddenly came from nearby. Matthias immediately recognized it as his brother's phone ringtone, and hope was instantly reignited. He immediately tied the pulley rope around himself, intending to enter the deep well to search for the phone. Jeff and Eric desperately turned the crank beside him, slowly lowering Matthias into the deep well. But before he went very deep, Amy suddenly screamed. A section of the rope was about to break.
Jeff? The rope, I think it's... Wait! Pull it up! Pull him up! Hurry! Hurry! What is it?
With a dull thud, Matthias instantly disappeared from everyone's sight. Fortunately, Eric faintly heard the sound of him moving at the bottom of the well, confirming that he was still alive. Jeff and Eric immediately turned the crank, asking either Amy or Stacy to go down to check the situation. After a brief hesitation, Stacy volunteered to go. She quickly put on the rope and slowly descended into the dark well. Fortunately, this time Stacy successfully reached the bottom, but due to the previous break, the rope only allowed her to descend to about 3 meters above the bottom. Listening to Matthias's weak cries from below, Stacy hesitated for a moment, then untied the rope and jumped down. But the moment she landed, a shard of glass pierced her leg deeply. She could only grit her teeth, pull out the shard, and press her clothing onto the wound for simple bleeding control. Soon she discovered that Matthias's lower body had completely lost sensation, and they could only dismantle a tent to make a makeshift stretcher to rescue him. But this also meant that Amy had to go down to help, a decision that completely unnerved her. She suddenly rushed down the pyramid, wanting to beg the Mayans for help, and Jeff quickly ran after her. Due to the language barrier, the Mayans could not understand her at all, and simply drove them back to the pyramid. This result completely broke Amy. In anger, she grabbed a handful of weeds and threw them at the Mayans. This action made the leader panic instantly, and they quickly moved away from the tribesman who had been hit by the weeds. He then shouted for him to leave the group and go to the top of the pyramid, but the tribesman stood there, looking completely confused. Seeing that he did not respond at all, they did not hesitate to kill him, and then directed their weapons back at Amy and Jeff. It was only at this moment that they finally realized that those plants were truly problematic. But even when they had climbed the pyramid earlier, everyone had come into contact with these plants. Meanwhile, the phone ringtone came from the bottom of the well again. Stacy bravely went forward to check, only to find that the ringtone was coming from a patch of pitch-black grass. She immediately backed away in fear and huddled next to Matthias. Soon, Amy was carried down on a makeshift stretcher. Since the stretcher was still some distance above the ground, they had to work together to lift Matthias up, although both of them were as careful as possible in handling him. When they lifted Matthias's knees and shoulders, a clear cracking sound of bones still echoed. After Matthias was finally carried out of the abandoned well, they placed him beside it and did not dare to move him again. Fortunately, the lighting equipment above the abandoned well was still working, and Amy also found a car key in her backpack. These discoveries reignited a glimmer of hope in them, They covered Matthias with a blanket to keep him warm, while Jeff stayed outside to keep watch. The next morning, when Stacy woke up, she suddenly realized something was very wrong with her legs. She hurriedly pulled back the blanket and discovered that vines had somehow wrapped around her legs and even penetrated her wounds. This terrifying scene made her scream, and it was only when Eric forcibly pulled out the vines that she was able to calm herself. Meanwhile, Matthias outside also began shouting loudly, indicating that something was moving on his legs as well. When Amy pulled back the blanket, she was completely stunned. The vines had deeply embedded themselves into his flesh, as if merging with his body. This horrifying sight left both Amy and Jeff at a loss, unable to do anything but stare blankly at what was before them. Before all this terror occurred, they were just a group of young people on vacation in Mexico. They had intended to spend the last day of their holiday leisurely, but unexpectedly met Matthias, a German here for an adventure. During the conversation, they learned that Matthias's brother had gone to explore the nearby pyramid, and he was also planning to go to the ruins tomorrow to search for his brother. This thrilling adventure full of unknowns immediately piqued the curiosity of the young people. To make the trip even more exciting, they did not hesitate to join Matthias's adventure plan. But no one expected that this seemingly casual adventure would send them into a living hell from which they could never escape. They took a truck toward the site marked on the map. Although the road was extremely bumpy, everyone was excited for the adventure ahead. As the truck entered deep into the forest, the road ahead became impassable, and the six had to get off in a clearing to prepare to walk. When she learned they had to walk a full 10 miles, Amy was not happy, but with her boyfriend's reassurance, they continued deeper into the forest. Soon, by a small creek, Matthias discovered a path that had been intentionally blocked, clearly because the locals did not want others to find the place. But the group did not care. Instead, they ran deeper into the forest with excitement. Sure enough, after passing along a small path, the abandoned pyramid appeared before them. They cheered and eagerly observed everything around the pyramid. But several Mayans suddenly appeared and forced them up the pyramid. Then something even more terrifying happened. The plants at the top silently crept into their wounds. As they contemplated how to deal with the wounds, a phone rang again, and the four immediately decided to find it and call for help before making any further plans. They made 2 makeshift torches, and then sent Amy and Stacy back into the abandoned well. Using the dim torchlight, they cautiously followed the sound of the ringing, but it still seemed to come from the pitch-black grass ahead. Though the morning's ordeal still haunted them, they gritted their teeth and stepped into the grass to try to escape. After passing through a narrow passage, they found a woman leaning against the vines. Amy carefully approached to check, and realized the woman's body had long since decayed. The only intact thing was the phone clutched tightly in her hand. But when they took the phone, they discovered it was completely broken. There was no way it could have been producing the ringing sound. At that moment, Amy heard the ringing again, and this time she realized an even more terrifying truth. The ringing they had mistaken for a lifeline was actually coming from the bizarre plants in front of them. Then the vines seemed to come alive, wildly lunging at them. After finally escaping the abandoned well, both were on the verge of collapse, crying out that the ringing was coming from the plants. They desperately wanted to get out, and Eric wholeheartedly agreed, but Jeff insisted that running would only hasten their deaths, and they could not abandon Matthias. Someone would come to rescue them. After an argument, the group fell silent again, sharing what little bread and water remained. Meanwhile, Matthias's legs were severely infected, and if left untreated, he would not survive until rescue arrived. The only option was amputation, a decision no one wanted to face. But ultimately, Matthias agreed to it himself. Jeff sent Amy and Stacy back to the tent, while he and Eric used stones and a knife to perform the brutal surgery on Matthias. At this point, Matthias's legs were almost reduced to bare bones. They used a heated skillet to sterilize and barely managed to complete the operation. Fortunately, his nerves were severely damaged, and Matthias felt almost no pain, which allowed him to survive, but his heart-wrenching screams completely broke Amy and Stacy inside the tent. That night, after Amy and Eric calmed the terrified Stacy to sleep, they went outside the tent to talk. Prolonged fear caused Amy's emotions to spiral out of control. She couldn't help but sob in Eric's arms. This scene was misinterpreted by the awakened Stacy, who angrily demanded to know what had just happened. The argument quickly drew Jeff's attention, and he rushed over, trying to calm everyone. But where no one noticed, several vines silently crept toward Matthias. By the time Jeff realized something was wrong, it was too late. Despite his frantic efforts to pull the vines away, Matthias had already lost his life. At that moment, no one had the strength to argue. Staring at the mangled Matthias, Stacy, in terror, believed the vines had also entered her own body. Out of control, she even grabbed a knife, ready to remove whatever was inside her. Jeff and Eric hurriedly tried to stop her, but something even more horrifying suddenly occurred. The vines beside them even began to mimic Stacy's frantic screams, and only then did Jeff and Eric realize that what the women had been saying was true. The next day, Jeff noticed that the Mayans were constantly sprinkling salt at the base of the pyramid to prevent the plants from spreading. At that moment, Eric called them into the tent, and they saw several clearly visible vines wriggling under Stacy's skin. To stop the plants from slowly consuming Stacy, they gritted their teeth and began removing the vines. They poured alcohol onto her skin, then carefully cut it open with a knife and forcefully pulled the vines out. The intense pain made it nearly impossible for Stacy to breathe, but she endured it through gritted teeth. But the real horror had only just begun. After a brief rest, Stacy's mental state grew increasingly erratic. The unknown fear slowly shattered her mind. She began to suspect that more vines remained inside her body. Eric and Jeff rushed to calm her, while Amy handed her a water bottle, trying to help her regain composure. But as she took a sip, all three clearly saw vines wriggling across her face. Although they quickly looked away, the fear had already shattered the last remnants of Stacy's sanity. Fortunately, after Eric's persistent reassurance, she temporarily calmed down. The prolonged thirst and constant fear soon caused everyone to fall into a drowsy sporo, but Stacy quietly slipped out of the tent. Stumbling, she rummaged through her backpack and finally grabbed a sharp knife. At that moment, nearby vines emitted human-like sounds again, triggering her already frayed nerves. Soon, Eric awoke with a start and rushed out of the tent, only to be horrified by the scene before him. Jeff rushed forward to stop her, but was slashed across the hand by the deranged Stacy. Eric tried to calm Stacy while slowly approaching, attempting to take the knife from her hand, but Stacy had had enough of meaningless reassurances. In a frenzy, she stabbed Eric violently with the knife. Eric soon succumbed to the fatal chest wound, and before anyone could react, the vines quickly reached out and dragged him away. The guilt of killing her boyfriend and the pain from the wriggling vines inside her completely overwhelmed Stacy, who screamed for the others to end her life. Though deeply reluctant, Jeff raised the knife and personally ended her suffering. By now, they had been trapped atop the pyramid for 3 full days, with all their food gone and no rescue in sight. They could only use the strength they still had to force their way out of the Mayans' encirclement. Jeff smeared the blood on Amy to disguise her, then carried her down the pyramid as if she were a corpse. He gently placed Amy on the ground and gave his girlfriend one final kiss. Then he shouted his rage at the Mayans, drawing all their attention toward himself. As all the Mayans chased him, he suddenly shouted for Amy to run immediately and not look back. The next moment, several arrows struck him down, and a horde of Mayans rushed out, intent on killing Amy. Soon, the vines smelled the blood and quickly crawled toward the struggling Jeff, prompting the leader to shoot and end his suffering. The gunshot caused Amy, who was running, to fall hard, but she had no time to grieve and scrambled up, sprinting desperately toward the car. The shouts of the Mayans grew louder behind her. Her feet were covered in blood, yet she dared not stop. Finally, the car started, and the Mayans disappeared from sight. Amy let out a sigh of relief, but at that moment, she suddenly felt something strange on her face. Vines had already infiltrated her body. A few days later, 2 Greeks entered the abandoned pyramid again. Their desire for adventure led them into a death trap. The moment the vines pierced their flesh, fear instantly took over their minds. The Mayans' blockade could not stop the spread of terror, and Amy's escape was only the beginning of the disaster. The vines were not just life-devouring demons, but also a mirror reflecting human weaknesses. Suspicion, fear, and irrationality pushed them all into the abyss. And this tragedy was far from over.